Hello fellow travellers and welcome to episode number 23 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. We're continuing our slow meandering through the history of the Roman Empire, following a path that will eventually lead a small settlement in central Italy to be the greatest power in the West at the time. From kings to consuls, Rome had changed quite a lot in its first 200 years of history, and its upwards trajectory didn't seem like it was stopping anytime soon. How, though, did the Romans go from nothing to rising power capable of carving its own path forwards despite the many challenges? As we've already seen, and we will see even more in the following episodes, the history of Rome is full of heroes and heroines, normal people willing to give up everything, including their lives, for the good of Rome. Horatius Cocles gave an eye, Mutius Scaevola his right arm. Camillus rose to the occasion and saved Rome, despite having been betrayed and discarded by the city itself. All these stories speak of courage, abnegation, and resilience, three traits highly valued by the Romans, who repaid these heroes by immortalizing their names and deeds in history and legend. We will see in this and in the next episode how such valued traits would save Rome on more than one occasion, turning what should have been terrible defeats and humiliations into spectacular victories. One thing you might have noticed in these episodes is that despite Rome calling itself a nation of warriors, the Romans seem to have lost more than they have won, at least at the beginning. At the start of the Res Publica, the time of the lightning-fast legions capable of conquering great swathes of land seems quite far in the future. In a way, this is only partially true. Yes, Rome had yet to fully establish itself on the battlefield, and yes, on more than one occasion, history came very close to be quite different than what we know today. But such an impression also comes from the fact that in this podcast, I'm hopping from hero to hero without paying much attention to the general context. I've overlooked many military engagements where the Romans won without fanfare, and I've concentrated my attention and yours on those battles where only the presence of a hero had saved the situation. By focusing on figures like Samnites or Camillus, one might get the impression that overall the Romans were faring quite badly against the neighbours, when the opposite is true. Setbacks aside, brilliantly solved by heroes worthy of a legend, the Romans had steadily subdued and conquered a lot of the local tribes of Latium, unifying quite a sizable territory under their control. It was still a far cry from the peak expansion of the Roman Empire, but it was a good starting point. In today's episodes, we'll focus our attention on both on Rome's first big military engagement on Italian soil and on Rome's first foray into the Mediterranean chessboard as the new rising power. Let me welcome you, my fellow travellers, to Rome's Wars of Expansion. Between the 4th and the 3rd century BC, the Samnites, clustered in a region that more or less comprises modern-day Molise, Abruzzo and Campania, were the leaders of the Italian Peninsula, not the Romans. Still, Rome was on a fast track to catch up, so it was only a matter of time before these two powers collided with each other. On paper, the Samnites had everything they needed to emerge from the conflict as the victors. The Roman army of the beginning was still very much Greek in its conception. Great focus on heavy infantry, organized in phalanxes, and armed with the light, round shields of the Greek hoplites, and a cavalry that seemed almost like an afterthought. On the other hand, the Samnites had both a cavalry, which was their pride and joy, and an infantry, which was much more adapted to the local terrains than the Romans were. Rather than big phalanxes, difficult to deploy on rough and rocky terrains, the Samnite soldiers were organized in smaller groups, all fitted with big shields, short swords, and long-range javelins. Such smaller units had a much easier time navigating the uneven terrain, while also prepared for long-range combat with javelins and short-range attacks, thanks to the swords and the shields. If one had to bet based only on the description of both armies, the Samnites seemed to be the safest bet for victory. The Romans, though, had one thing going for them. They had this extraordinary capacity of evolving themselves. For every enemy they met, they studied them, the combat techniques, the weapons and military units, and if they found something which could suit them better than their current equipment or strategy, the Romans would simply take it and incorporate it into their existing military structure. Nothing was wasted if it could help Rome achieve its goals. The Romans entered the Samnite Wars as the cocky but bumbling rookies on their first foray into the adult world. When they exited the wars, though, they had transformed themselves into an organized and better armored military machine, capable of extending its influence all the way to Greece and Africa. What happened, though, to transform the Roman army so radically? As I said, the Romans and the Samnites crossed swords in 3 different wars in the span of 50 years, between the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 3rd century BC. The first war started because the Samnite had laid siege to the city of Capua, which in turn had asked the Romans for their help. The Samnites must have been quite a threat if Capua had decided to rely on a still very much unproven power on the Italian stage. To be honest, at the beginning, Rome didn't want to deploy her troops in Capua's aid. They had treaties going on with the Samnites, which were profitable enough that the Romans didn't want to risk everything to go on a war whose results weren't clear from the get-go. Still, Capua insisted and promised Rome their undying loyalty forever. So Rome accepted and sent her legions to relieve the city. One of the 2 consuls and leaders of the army was a man named Marcus Valerius Corvus. He was quite a skilled politician and military leader, rising to the role of dictator twice during the First Samnite War. According to the legend, he lived to be 100 years old and was later remembered by the Romans as a memorable example of a man on whom the goddess Fortuna, the goddess of good luck, bestowed quite a lot of blessings. He gained the cognomen Corvus during one of the military campaigns against the Gauls in northern Italy. According to tradition, he was challenged to single combat by a Gaul, and as the 2 were preparing to strike each other, a Corvus, Latin for raven, settled on Valerius' helmet and distracted his enemy by flowing into his face, allowing the Roman to kill him. The result netted Valerius quite a reward, and his capability granted him consulship and leadership of the army during the First Samnite War. Of the 2 consuls in charge that year, with the other one being Aulus Cornelius Cossus, Valerius was clearly the best military leader. He managed to win against the Samnites in the battles of Mount Gaurus and in the Battle of Suessula. In the first one, the Romans' desperation to win struck so much fear into the hearts of their enemy that, according to Livy, so take the quote with a pinch of salt, when the Samnites were asked why they had fled the battlefield, the answer was because the eyes of the Romans seemed to blaze, along with their furious expression and frenzied glare. Also in the Battle of Suessula, Valerius and his legions managed to strike so much fear into their enemies that most of them fled, and those who didn't were killed by the Romans, netting Valerius quite a haul with 40,000 shields and 170 standards. But if Valerius seemed he could do no wrong on the battlefield, his consular colleague, on the other hand, was having quite a difficult military campaign. In the Battle of Saticula, he was almost trapped by a Samnite army on a mountain pass and transformed what would have been a devastating defeat into a victory only thanks to the courage of one of his military tribunes, Publius Decius Mus. As the army led by the consul was passing through a mountain pass which descended into a narrow valley, the Romans realized that the Samnites had taken the vantage points over the hills and had them surrounded. As the army was well on its way to panic, Publius Decius Mus noticed that the Samnites had failed to occupy one of the hills around them. Realizing it could be their ticket to freedom, Decius, with the consul's approval, led a detachment of 1,600 of his men to seize that one free hill. They had almost reached the top when the Samnites realized what they were doing and tried to stop them. In the end, Decius and his men made it to the relative safety of the hilltop, and their actions had distracted the Samnites enough that the consul managed to slip away with the rest of the Roman army. With his successful sortie, Decius had scored one partial victory against the Samnites, but he was now faced with a small problem, namely how to get his men down from the hill and back with the rest of the Roman army. When Decius had started out his heroic action, he must have thought that the chances of he and his men surviving the sortie were very slim. When the Samnites tried to attack the hilltop, it seemed as if such a prediction would come to pass. Which was why Decius found himself very surprised when, as night fell, rather than continue the assault, the Samnites simply went back to their camp. Deciding that this was too good an opportunity to pass up, Decius assembled his men and told them he intended to break out from their position that night. If they could manage to sneak through the Samnite camp silently, that would be preferable, but they were going to force their way out if they were discovered. His soldiers agreed, and they descended from the hilltop into the enemy camp below. It must have been quite a sight, that of 1,600 fully armoured men tiptoeing their way in complete darkness around the enemy camp. Unfortunately for them, their luck ran out as they were halfway through. Spotted by one of the sentinels, Decius and his men let out a mighty battle cry and charged to steal half of Sleep's Samnites. In the ensuing chaos, the Romans managed to cut their way through and were told that Decius didn't lose a single man. As Decius rejoined the main army, he convinced the consul to attack the Samnites, who were totally unprepared for battle, and all 30,000 of them were killed. Despite having come close to a defeat, Decius' daring and courage had managed to turn things around, granting the Romans victory. After having proven their superiority in battle, the Romans accepted the peace treaty offered by the Samnites, and the First Samnite War ended with Rome's triumph. It was the Second Samnite War, which would go down in history as one of the worst humiliations ever suffered by the Romans. Once again, the casus belli was given by the attack on a city. In this case, it was the Romans attacking Naples, with the city calling the Samnites to help. At the beginning, the war seemed to go quite well for the Romans, who, in the first 5 years, managed to conquer territory after territory, pushing the Samnites further south. And then came the year 321 BC, the year of the Battle of the Caudine Forks. To be fair, calling it a battle is a mere historical formality, since there was no fight involved in it, but only a unilateral surrender on the Roman part. I think it was probably referred to as a battle to somehow keep the Roman dignity intact, since the humiliation of the Caudine Forks sounds quite disgraceful. The Samnites were coming from one war already lost and a second which wasn't going in their favour at all. They desperately needed a win. According to Livy, the Samnite commander Gaius Pontius was willing to do just about anything to improve the situation. Knowing that the Romans were encamped near Calatia in modern-day Campania, he sent 10 soldiers disguised as herdsmen to the Roman camp, who told the same story, that the Samnites were in Lucera, modern-day Puglia, so quite a long way away from where the Romans were currently standing. Those 10 fake herdsmen were so convincing that the Romans commanders decided to move the army towards Lucera. Since they had to cover quite a distance, they chose the fastest route available, a path passing through a narrow mountain pass near Benevento in Campania, called the Caudine Forks. According to the sources, the pass had only one narrow entry point and one narrow exit. Not expecting a trap, the Roman army entered the ravine only to realize that their exit had been blocked. At that point, orders were given to turn back, with the commanders still not realizing that they had fallen into a trap. But when the army arrived at the entry point, they found it as blocked as their exit had been. It was at that moment that the Samnites revealed themselves and the reality of the situation started to sink in for the Romans. They were trapped, with no possibility of escape. Panic and despair started to grip the soldiers. As the Romans were coming to terms with their inevitable demise, the Samnites weren't quite as sure as they seemed to be. Yes, they had managed to trap the Roman army, but now that they had done so, they had no idea what to do with them. The commander Pontius decided to send a letter to his father Herennius, hoping to get some advice. Herennius replied that the Romans were to be freed and sent back home as soon as possible. Quite surprised by advice, and unwilling to believe his father could have really written it, Pontius sent another letter. This time the reply was quite different. Herennius suggested to kill the Romans down to the very last man. Faced with two very much opposite pieces of advice, Pontius sent for his father. When Herennius arrived, he told his son that he had but two choices. One, to send the Romans back unarmed, to gain Rome's favour and friendship. 2. To kill every last soldier and cripple Rome's military power for years to come. Not willing to go to neither of these extremes, Pontius asked if there was a middle way. And his father answered that the middle way was folly, and that would leave the Romans smarting for revenge without weakening them. Having said his piece, Herennius left his son to make the decision. In the end, Pontius decided that both the solutions were too extreme, so he opted for the middle way. He let the Romans live, but he insisted that the entire army passed under a yoke, wearing nothing but their underwear. Knowing that the alternative was death, in which case Rome would be left completely unprotected, the commanders accepted the humiliation. Most of the soldiers followed suit, and those who decided they could not compromise their honor to this extent were killed on sight by the Samnites. In the end, the Romans were spared, but the humiliation they suffered would prove fatal for the Samnites. Pontius had thought he'd stop the Romans' ambitions in their tracks by demonstrating the Samnites' superiority, and he thought he'd come across as a merciful leader, since he had let the Romans go. But in the end, the middle way he had chosen proved to be exactly the folly his father had predicted. The Roman Senate laid the entire fault of such humiliation at both commanders' feet, and since Rome had not lost the entire army, it was easy enough for the Romans to reorganize themselves stronger than before. In the end, while the Romans did lose another pitched battle on the Cumini Mountains, they managed to win the Second Samnite War. After 2 consecutive defeats, one could have expected the Samnites to simply retreat back into their territories and live their own lives in peace. But they wanted to wash away the stain of defeat, and so Samnium and Rome entered into the third and final Samnite War. This time the Samnites decided to change tactics. Until that moment they had faced the Romans alone, but given the track record, it was time to try something new. Feeling that they couldn't possibly be the only ones resenting Rome and its expansionism, the Samnites built a series of anti-Roman alliances. In the end, they managed to create a formidable coalition with all the tribes that had, in the past decades, fought against the Romans: the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and the Senone Gauls. If this coalition had managed victory, history would be quite different indeed. After a series of minor skirmishes, things came to a head at the beginning of the 3rd century BC. The coalition started preparation for a pitched battle against the Romans. The Romans knew that if they were to face all the allied tribes together, the chances of victory would be slim to non-existent. So they decided to apply a policy that would prove quite a success: divide et impera, divide and conquer. They sent some legions to attack the city of Clusium, thus forcing the Etruscans and the Umbrians to break off and go back to save their territories. According to Livy, such a maneuver was enough to even out the two armies, and the historians went as far as to say that if the Etruscans and the Umbrians had been present, the battle would not have gone the Romans' way. As it was, 40,000 Romans faced 40,000 Samnites and allies in the Battle of Sentinum, sometimes referred as the Battle of the Nations. In this war, we find an old friend once again. Having demonstrated his courage and might in the First Samnite War, when his actions helped his consul snatch a victory from the jaws of defeat, Publius Decius Mus had gone on to have quite the successful military career, and by the time of the Third Samnite War, he was the best military commander the Romans had, together with his fellow consul Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus. It was on these two that Rome relied to win the battle and the war. Quintus Fabius fought defensively, making the battle a test of endurance, waiting for the enemy's energy to flag before inflicting the decisive charge. Publius Decius, on the other hand, fought aggressively, trying to rout the enemy with his cavalry charges. While Quintus Fabius' strategy awarded him an easy victory, Publius Decius soon found himself surrounded by the enemy's chariot, which managed to break his cavalry formation. Knowing that nothing short of a miracle would help them in such a situation, Publius Decius did as his father had done before and performed the devotio. In ancient Rome, the devotio was an extreme vow, where a Roman general would offer his life to the gods in order to secure a victory. And so, after having prayed the gods, Decius launched himself into the enemy lines, effectively killing himself, but also managing to galvanize his troop with his actions. Suddenly revitalized, his men were able to break through, and under the command of the remaining consul, the Romans managed to score a decisive victory against the coalition. In the end, the Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls pulled out of the war, leaving the Samnites alone. They fought valiantly for another 5 years, but the end results were already written. The Samnites capitulated, and Rome gained control over much of central and south of Italy. Now that the Romans had finally prevailed over the Samnites, gaining control over their territories in the southern part of Italy, this finally brought Rome in contact with Greece. The colonies of the Magna Grecia in the south of Italy were independent Hellenistic city-states that, until that moment, had never come into contact with Rome and its budding empire. To be honest, Greece had no idea that Rome even existed at this point, with none of the main Greek historians, like Herodotus, even mentioning the city of Romulus in passing. What was about to happen, though, would finally make the nascent power of Rome and the established Hellenistic power of Greece finally interact. More or less a decade after Rome's victory in the Third Samnite War, the city of Tarentum in Magna Grecia sent a message back to the motherland requesting help. Rome and Tarentum had a treaty which specified that Rome was never to send warships into the Tarentine Gulf. While the Romans had not meant to attack Tarentum with the ships they sent to the south of Italy, their actions clearly spooked the Tarentinians enough that they sank some of the Romans' warships. Starting a war with Rome, they were ill-equipped to fight. So the city of Tarentum sent for help, requesting the aid of Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, a region near Macedonia. Nowadays, if Pyrrhus is remembered, he is only remembered for his empty victories, his incapabilities of seeing things through, and his rather anticlimactic and most embarrassing death. In reality, the king of Epirus was a very fine commander with a great pedigree. While his being a descendant of Achilles is debatable, him being a relative of Alexander the Great is proven. It's worth to point out that at this point, that while the Romans were busy vanquishing the Samnites for a little extra corner of Italy, Alexander the Great was living his life, conquering everything in his sight. So the Tarentinians asked Pyrrhus for help. Never having heard of the Romans before, and considering them no more than barbarians, Pyrrhus accepted the request and crossed over to Italy with an army of 25,000 soldiers, more or less, mostly infantrymen, organized in the famous Macedonian phalanxes, and 20 elephants. While those animals weren't as big as the elephants we see in zoos today, they were still twice the size of a horse. And most importantly, the Romans had never seen them before. Immediately, Pyrrhus set out to demonstrate the Hellenic superiority. Yes, the Romans had won against the Samnites, but for one, they were still in the process of incorporating all the new techniques and weapons in their arsenal. For two, one of the consuls was still occupied trying to quell a rebellion in Etruria. Moreover, we have to consider that while the Samnites had been indeed difficult opponents, there was still a local Italian power, not exactly a player in the known world. The Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC ended with Pyrrhus's victory over the Romans, demonstrating the superiority of the Macedonian phalanx and making full use of the terrified surprise that the elephants had elicited in the Romans. Pyrrhus did suffer quite some heavy losses, but he was able to replenish his ranks with the local populations. Quite sure of his military superiority and not interested in dragging the war for longer than needed, Pyrrhus offered peace to the Romans. The Senate actually debated whether or not to accept the terms, which weren't as heavy as expected, but included the humiliating clause that Rome should bow to Tarentum's superiority. As they were about to accept, the senators were interrupted by the grand entrance of Appius Claudius Caecus, a man better remembered for the constructions of the Via Appia, who fervently opposed such a treaty, saying that Rome shouldn't bow to anyone on Italian soil. In the end, the Senate rejected the peace offer and Pyrrhus and the Romans engaged once again in battle. The Battle of Asculum went down in history not because it was another of Pyrrhus's triumphs, nor because it was yet another battle where a Publius Decius Mus had performed a devotio and died for Rome, but because this is the battle that gave rise to the saying Pyrrhic victory. At the end of the battle, when one of his soldiers congratulated Pyrrhus on his victory, the king of Epirus is said to have answered with a bitter, "If we are victorious in another battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." While Pyrrhus had won against the Romans in the end, he'd lost so much of his army that his was basically a hollow victory. Hence why today we say Pyrrhic victory to mean a victory that negates any true sense of achievement. It's after this battle that Pyrrhus started to think that maybe he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Tarentum had withdrawn his support for Pyrrhus's army, and while the king of Epirus did manage to get close to the city of Rome, he found it too heavily guarded and not easily taken. It's at this point that Pyrrhus received two offers. The Greek cities in Sicily asked for his help to drive away the Carthaginians, and the Macedonians asked Pyrrhus to become their next king. Deeming Sicily the better offer, Pyrrhus set out for the island where he started a campaign which would last a couple of years and end with the Sicilians so fed up with him that they decided to join forces with the Carthaginians. While Pyrrhus managed to defeat the joint army, at the same time he received word that most of Magna Graecia, except Tarentum, had been conquered by the Romans, and so he left Sicily and hurried back. It's at this moment that he is supposed to have said another sentence which has gone down in history as a premonition of things to come. As he watched Sicily disappear on the horizon, Pyrrhus said, "What a wrestling ground we are living, my friends, for the Carthaginians and the Romans." Not much later, his words would prove prophetic, as Rome and Carthage engaged in a series of conflicts which would last over a century. While Pyrrhus had been busy in Sicily, the Romans had rebuilt their army, and one of the two consuls, Manius Curius Dentatus, was encamped near the city of Maleventus in Campania. In order to avoid the other consul coming to join his colleague, Pyrrhus sent half his army to stop him, and was left to deal with Dentatus himself. Trying to surprise him, Pyrrhus had his army march through the night, but they got lost and arrived into position only as day was dawning, at which point they were tired and they had very much been noticed by the Romans. Once again, Pyrrhus demonstrated great skills and was able to resist and push back the first wave of the Romans. But then, as his enemies proved that they had gotten over their fear of the elephants and they had finally mastered the new strategies, the king of Epirus was forced to retreat. Realizing that he didn't have the resources to keep going, Pyrrhus abandoned Italy, thus giving the Romans the victory, and they renamed the city of Maleventum into Beneventum, the name it still has today. Their first interaction with the Hellenistic world had ended in the Romans' victory, thus cementing their status as an emerging power. And Pyrrhus? He went back to Epirus, from where he was called once again, this time to aid in a war against Sparta. In the Battle of Argos, as Pyrrhus found himself trapped into a narrow street, he was hit by a tile thrown by an old woman, with enough force to either kill him on the spot or paralyzing him enough that he was subsequently killed by an enemy soldier. And so ended Pyrrhus's life. It's said that when the Tarentinians learned of his death, they surrendered to the Romans. With Pyrrhus's death, it's time for us to come to the end of another episode. In basically the span of 1 century, Rome had gone from rising but still very much local power to emerging player on the Mediterranean board. It had taken the Romans time and quite a lot of losses, but they had demonstrated quite a good amount of resilience, refusing to back down even when the situation should have been desperate. Such attitude had granted them impossible victories, and it would prove to be the key to unlock even more successes in the future. Now that the Romans had tasted the sweet nectar of victory, they felt disinclined to go back to their own little corner of the world. It was now time to demonstrate to everybody the Romans' valor, and to do so they would engage in a century-long conflict with their toughest enemy yet, Carthage. For a long time, the fate of Rome would hang in the balance, as Hannibal the Great scored victory over victory against Romulus's descendants. And yet the Romans never faltered, their resilience coming to their aid once more, until nothing but salt remained of their enemies. I will wait for you here in 2 weeks, where we'll go and explore how the Romans' courage, resilience and luck managed to turn around their fates. In the meantime, I invite you once again to join me on my Instagram channel, The Apple and the Hero. And when you do, please say hi. I'm very happy to make your acquaintance. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.